So hi, I'm Charlie. I mainly study metascience and replicability. My background is in psychology, so that's mainly the experience I'll be speaking from. If you have any questions, anything you want to ask me, email's there. DMs are open if Twitter is more your medium. This is not just a shameless bid for followers. I also like to just start with some disclosures up front. So the ethical ones, I get my support from the John Templeton Foundation and the Institute of Behavioral Science at CU Boulder. Every now and again, someone pays me to speak about stuff like this one. And probably more important for understanding my talk, the more practical ones. A lot of this is my own experience. The things I study from a metascientific lens are mainly from the psychology literature, to the extent to which my advice generalizes. Not going to make any claims there. And as I've heard and quite like, the plural of anecdote is an anecdata, so I'm going to talk a lot about anecdotes, but I'm not going to present a lot of hard and fast data, so grain of salt on my advice. Cool. So I want to start with thinking a bit more conceptually about what is a replication. And I'm very thankful for the talks that I'm following, because they help with a lot of the definitional lift of some of the things I'm going to talk about. But for my talk today, I'm going to adopt a pretty broad definition. So in my mind, a replication is a study where there is some theoretical and or empirical reason a priori to expect a particular outcome. So this is a bit riffed from my advisor Brian Nozick and a colleague Tim Arrington's definition on replication. I got it from a paper that I saw a draft of months ago. Of course, they released the preprint right after I sent my slides to Alex, so there's a more beautiful definition in the paper. It's on SciArchive. I would look and quote them, but this is the gist of it. And yeah, that's a pretty broad definition, but I think it has a lot of utility. And when we think about replication, really, I think we're trying to understand how strong of an argument we can make in line with that claim. So if we have a stronger reason to expect a given outcome from a study, that's what I'm going to call maybe a more direct replication. So these are instances where maybe a study has been done on a particular population with a particular set of methods. If I take those same methods and apply it to a pretty similar population, I've got a pretty strong expectation that I think I should see the same results again. However, as that argument gets weaker, we get into more of the realm of at least what we refer to in psychology as more conceptual replications. So this is, I have a similar idea, I'm expecting a certain pattern of results to come out, but maybe I'm changing things about the methods, maybe I'm very much varying the population that I'm studying. So I've got some reason to expect a given outcome, but I have less of a strong argument that I should expect that outcome to happen. So what's so special about replication research? Why am I taking the time before lunch to talk about it? In many ways, I think nothing. Replication studies have a lot of the same features of kind of everyday scientific research. It's like most science in that respect. It's a part of the process, and we're using kind of the same epistemic thought process to try and learn from these studies. But in some ways, I think replication research is different. By the definition of replication, it potentially has more consequence for our current understanding of phenomena. If there's a theoretical or empirical reason to expect that I should get a certain pattern of results, and I don't, we have to grapple with that evidence and see if we should change our understanding of prior phenomena, of prior theories. And I think something that gets emphasized quite a bit is that this comes with social stakes. And I think those social stakes are very understandable. For better or worse, science is done by people. We have things that we want to be true. We study questions that we think are interesting. So if someone is coming along and validating our work, and I will speak just for myself, like, yeah, I want my stuff to replicate. I think it's a cool idea. That's why I did the study in the first place, and it'd be great if other people found the same thing. And I think that adds a little bit more social consequence working with other scientists when doing this work. So what I'm going to do for the rest of my time today is really focus on the why and how of doing replication research. This isn't a talk about why we should be doing replication research more broadly, the kind of like philosophy of science arguments. I'm assuming you've all already drunk that Kool-Aid. If you haven't, argue with me on Twitter. But I want to talk about why you might do something that you'd consider a replication, and why, and how the why will affect the how. So again, I'm going to ask the question, why would you want to do replication research? Talk a bit about your reasoning for doing the study, how it should affect how you go about doing the study, and then kind of end with a general grab bag of tips and strategies, I think, for maximizing your goals and why you want to do that study. And I don't think I said this up top, but if you have questions and want to interrupt me at any point, please do. Happy to more talk with you than at you. All right. So why would you do a replication study? This is not an exhaustive list of goals, but I think these are the ones that I most commonly come across when people are talking about replication research. And I want to go through each one and kind of say what the goal is. So the first one, and this might seem like the most popular one, is verification. In the impetus for a replication study that's kind of in the verification realm, often goes something like this. There's some cool, some interesting, dubious, insert your own adjective here, study out there that I come across in the literature. And I want to get more information about it. So this might be curiosity, this might be concern about a particular way the study was done, but there's an idea that's worth looking into more. And frankly, we just could use some more information on it. So I'd like to do another study on that topic. Another reason you might do something that's considered a replication is for the purposes of theory expansion. So this one typically goes along the lines of there's some interesting idea out there, there's some interesting study, but maybe the context of testing that idea is pretty narrow. So all of the research is done, with undergrads at universities or using a particular manipulation or particular measure. I think this idea should generalize, so let's see if it does. Let's try and expand the context in which this theory has been tested. A third reason you might want to do a replication is because it might have some sort of utility for your own research, the questions that you're interested in studying. So this often flows from coming across a phenomenon or a methodology that seems that it could be useful in your program of research. But before you start kind of deploying it to answer your own questions, you want to see if you can get it to work in your lab before you start betting more on it. So like a good example might be, say I study racial prejudice, and I want to study how if people feel like they're more public versus private in their thoughts, that might affect how they express that. There's a nice literature on how people behave when they think they're in the public eye versus if they think they're not. I might pick some manipulation, some study from that literature that I want to build upon. But first, I just want to make sure I can get that study to work. So that might be a reason I do this. And the final reason, and this is the more personal one for me, I guess, is for meta-science. So you might have some sort of question about how science is done or how the features of how we do science affect the results that we find. And a great way to test those often is to replicate prior studies. You're trying to find studies that you think might be good test cases for the phenomenon of interest. So a meta-science question that's really popular right now in my discipline of social psychology concerns the question of expertise in trying to get results. Do you have to really have a lot of experience in a given literature to be able to get the effects to work? So, I might try and find some sort of study that I think expertise might really matter. Maybe you need to know the secret sauce to get it to work. And that's why I would replicate that study. So those are the reasons why, and it very much directly shifts into the how of doing replication research. In that one of the first things that you'll do as you're trying to plan a replication study or a program of research around replications is what I'm going to refer to as study selection. And I just want to preface this with, in my experience, study selection is probably the single most important design decision you will make in doing a replication. And it basically just refers to what is the study you're going to base your replication on. So if we're kind of on the more direct side of doing replications, there's some phenomenon that I'm interested in and I want to test it with a study. There might be many studies on that phenomenon out there. Which one do I pick to replicate? That's the process of study selection. I think there are various ways to kind of go through that study selection process, and I think they should very much be shaped by your goals in doing replication research. So for instance, say you are interested in a question more of verification. There's this cool theory, I want to get more information on it. Which study from the literature should you pick to replicate? In that case, maybe you want to go for maybe more canonical studies or paradigms that are more often used in the literature. If 80% of studies use a particular manipulation or a particular measure, maybe go toward that one, because your replication will have more information value that way. You're trying to validate what's been done. Picking the thing that gets done the most might be a way to get the most bang for your buck. In the case of theory expansion, this might be less important, because your goal here is you're kind of trying to deviate what has been from what has been done previously. So you might take elements from prior studies, but since you're kind of freestyling at baseline, you might not have a great like one-to-one comparison with a prior study that you select. If you're in it to try and develop some utility for your own research, I'd really just think about which paradigm is going to work the best for you. So which manipulations will be easiest for you to do in your lab. Which effects are strong enough that you can probably detect with the samples that you have access to. And also if you're trying to build another study on the back of it, what kind of things will gel together? What kind of manipulations might flow into the questions that you're interested in and won't kind of give your participants whiplash as you go from one topic to the other. And finally, in meta-science, I think it's very fair to think a lot about which paradigm is most likely to demonstrate your question of interest. So again, in the example of trying to look at maybe the impact of researcher expertise, picking a study where there are decisions that have to be made by the researcher that someone with more expertise might know how to make. If it's something that is incredibly straightforward and you just grab the Qualtrics file and hit run, expertise might not matter as much there. I will also say that it probably helps to try and pick something that you think might replicate. For signs on that, I'd revisit Joe's talk. And the reason there is simple, that a lot of meta-science questions are about moderators of prior effects. And if there's no effect there, you're not going to find any moderation. So you probably want a phenomenon that you think to be is true, and sometimes that's hard to pick out. So I just want to briefly go back to my definition of replication, and in particular this continuum. We can think about these various goals in the studies that we might select to replicate as existing somewhere on that continuum. So generally, things like verification, replications are probably going to end up on the stronger, more direct end of the spectrum. And the reason there being is I want to be able to say something about what's been done previously. How much trust should we have in this literature? And if I'm designing new studies, designing new methods, maybe those methods just aren't great for verifying that effect. There might be other things going on. But if I'm basing off of research that we've all kind of accepted as this is a good demonstration of the phenomenon, I've taken out some of those alternative explanations. Things like utility for your research in meta-science might end up on the kind of more direct end. And this is, again, the more you change about a prior study, the more alternative explanations for discrepant results you have. And if I really want the thing to exist because I'm studying some meta-scientific moderator or because I want to use it to answer another question, I probably don't want to deviate too far from the prior path. Theory expansion is the one that normally ends up on the weaker and more conceptual side. And that's, again, very much by design. I'm intentionally trying to look into new areas and new realms of generalizability for a finding. And in order to get there, I have to change up what has been done prior. All right. So at this point, you've thought about why you might want to do a replication study. You've thought about what study you want to base your research off of and how kind of close to that you want to be. The next thing in study design that you need to do is figure out what you're going to do to collect your data. So in the instance of psychology research, it's what am I going to show to my participants? What am I going to ask them? What am I going to measure? The nice thing is for a lot of replication work, some of these decisions might already be made. So again, if you're trying to do a more direct replication, you're trying to adhere more closely to what has been done previously, this might be easy. You try and go get the original materials and methods. I say I should probably do air quotes for easy because sometimes it's hard to get those original things, especially if you're trying to replicate a study from 20, 30 years ago. The original materials might not exist. But in theory, you know the target you're shooting for. You're trying to get as close to what has been done previously as you can. But if you're trying to do a more conceptual replication, you've got some decisions to make. And I think about these decisions very much on the kind of axis of how far do you want to stray from previous work? How much do you want to try and expand our understanding of a theory or of a phenomenon. So some things that often get varied, I might vary the sample source. I might pick people that are very different from what the original work was done on. So maybe I'm trying this in another culture, in another country. Maybe I'm trying to get folks from the general population as opposed to university undergrads. You also might vary the measures, so maybe a different conceptualization of your dependent variable. I want to make sure it's not just a quirk of how a given like trait has been measured prior in the literature, or you might vary the manipulations, in particular for experimental work. So I might be trying to elicit the phenomenon in a new context. With all of these, though, there's a trade-off. The further you stray from stuff that's been demonstrated to work, the more risk you have that it just won't for reasons that aren't interesting for your theory. Maybe a manipulation that you design just isn't good at eliciting the feelings or the emotions that you want in your participants. But if you are able to get something new that works, you give the research community a new context in which to test the theory. So there is some risk and reward with those judgments. Another big decision that you'll need to make is planning your sample, at least if you're kind of collecting new data. If you're diving into archival data to test a prior phenomenon or theory, the sample size might be dictated to you, but for this slide, let's assume you're planning a new data collection. In this case, you have to worry about statistical power, and power is tricky when trying to plan things. A big reason for that is something like publication bias. If you want to base your power estimates on effect sizes in the literature, those effect sizes might be selectively reported. They might be larger than what you would reasonably expect in your context. So if you base your power off of them, you might actually be quite underpowered, is the concern. This is another case where I would just return to your goals for the study as kind of your guiding principle. So for instance, in an instance where you're trying to verify prior work, as much as possible, I would go for broke on the sample. You have a stronger argument the more power you have, and if there's uncertainty about what a kind of effect size you can expect, just kind of try and compensate to the best you can with a lot of power. So in psychology, we'll often try and organize direct replication studies where teams at multiple universities will all collect data. Nice for generalizability, although how much undergrads vary from one institution to another is an open question. But it'll give you a much larger sample, and you don't have to rely on a prior estimate as much to justify your power. On the other hand, if this is something that you want to use in your own research, I would collect what you normally can for a study. And the reason there is, say there's some manipulation in the literature that I want to use, but it's a very weak manipulation. If I don't have endless participants, then that manipulation isn't particularly useful to me. So with kind of my standard sample, given the resources I have, I can't elicit effect. That's useful for me to know. Maybe if I had twice the sample, I could find it, but I'm not going to, so it's useless to me if I can't. And finally, if you're more in the realm of theory expansion, it really comes down to what you're willing to invest. Because again, you're going out into parts unknown in the kind of the theory space of a given phenomenon. You don't know if all of the aspects of your research design are going to work the way you want them to, because maybe you haven't seen them demonstrated before. So there's a bit of a risk. Maybe there's some procedural flaw in your study that you haven't figured out yet, and you need to run the study to figure out where it went wrong. If you throw a ton of participants at it, that might be a waste. On the other hand, if you don't give yourself enough chance to detect the effect, given your new measure, your new manipulations and the like, you might miss out on something cool otherwise. So that's very much I don't have a good answer there, but just think about the risks and rewards as you try and plan that study. In a lot of replication research, there ends up at some point being some sort of interaction with the original authors. And these are the people who did the research that you're most basing your replication study on. This is, I think, where the social dynamics are most at play in replication. And I think it's worth thinking about them and talking about them, because it will affect the work that you do, and it's also good to have positive interactions with people. So first, why might you do this? In my experience, I think in a lot of replications, at some point, they end up interacting with the original authors. So there's very practical reasons you might do this. So for instance, you might be trying to get the original materials. They're not online, so you might ask them if they could share those with you. Furthermore, you might have questions about the procedure, so you may be able to largely recreate the methods from the original paper, but you might have questions about, the timing of something or what the lab space looked like that you just might want to clear before you do the study. And finally, you might just want to give them a heads up and say, hey, I'm just letting you know I'm going to be doing this study. It builds on your work. I wanted you to be aware of it. Some people might appreciate that because then they can, track and see how your project's going. It's also sometimes nice because there might be some of those secret steps that don't exactly make it into the method sections of papers that they might tell you. So you might say, hey, just letting you know, I'm planning to replicate this study. And they might be willing to tell you, like, oh, we've done studies since then, and we found that, like, you need to order these measures in this way, and we didn't know that at the time. But, like, as a kind of insider tip, that might be something you want to do. I have a general rule for these interactions because I think they can sometimes be intimidating, especially if you're like an early career researcher approaching a much more established person that you're following up on their work. And the general rule for the interaction is they're like you. So I suspect they are generally nice people. They probably like science and research, and that's why they're doing it. And they're probably busy. And those traits will probably explain most of the ways they interact with you. I think if you treat them accordingly, most interactions go well. So overall, I'd recommend try to be sensitive both to their time and the personal stakes in the results. You're often emailing them out of the blue, asking them for advice, asking them for materials. That takes time. They probably didn't budget that into their schedule, so maybe they'll need some time to get back to you. And another general rule is kind of treat it like asking questions in courses. If it's on the syllabus, it's not necessarily the best look if you're asking it as a clarifier. So try and give a good faith effort to kind of find your own answers before you approach them. In a lot of cases, the things that you need, like original materials, especially for older studies, aren't out there. But maybe do a quick check, look for materials shared on professional websites, things like that, just so that you don't ask them and the immediate response is, oh, here's the link and it was in the paper. You should have been able to find it. Maybe not the best start to that interaction. All right. So at this point, you have thought about your study, you've designed it, you've gone ahead and executed it. Now you're to the stage where you're trying to report this. I think publishing, for better and worse, is a very important step in the scientific process. We need to share our knowledge with other folks for it to be useful. So probably not a controversial statement. Publishing is hard. It is hard for all research. I think publishing replication studies adds some extra hurdles that as a researcher you'll have to deal with. So again, there are added stakes to these things. There are personal stakes to some other researchers that will likely be reviewers on your papers, and that can make that process a bit tricky. It can add more scrutiny. I think there is a pretty well documented bias towards novelty in the literature. Journals like publishing things that seem new and exciting, and replications, by their very definition, are only so new. They add to our understanding of phenomenon, but you're building on something that has been done, and that might be seen as a hit against you in the publication process. And I think, bluntly, the final point is these are very much wrapped up in a movement of reform that's happening in a lot of scientific disciplines right now. And reform is inherently political. Replications are a part of that, and that is part of the dynamic in getting them published. People have opinions on the thought of doing replication studies at all, and they will express those opinions to them or act on those as you try to get your work published. I think there are some ways to try and navigate these challenges, though. The first is to be very thoughtful about your outlet. So journals vary in how much they want to consider or publish replication work. On the other hand, you sometimes will see journals that very explicitly state that we are about the cutting edge of science and we only publish the new and most interesting. So, maybe not that place. I would look at journals in your field and see what they've been publishing recently. If you see in particular direct replications coming out of that journal, they might be an outlet that's interested in taking this work. Journals aren't static over time. They very much change with the editor who is in charge. Often when a new editor takes over, they'll release some sort of statement like, these are my visions for the journal going forward. And those are pretty useful, I think, to read. Some journal editors, especially ones that are coming in now, will say, I'm thinking about these reform issues seriously. I want us to publish more replication research, put less value on novelty. that might be a good place to send your paper. And in particular, I'd say you can look for what has been called the Pottery Barn rule, which I think is just a riff on the you break it, you buy it. Some journals have the opinion that if we thought an original study was worth publishing, it means we should think that a replication of it is worth publishing. And they've made a commitment to publish or pay particular attention to direct replications of work that's already been published in their journal. If you see editors that have talked about that, that's probably a good outlet if you've published a study that's based on something from that journal. Another tip, and this is admittedly a bit of a lazy tip, is to try to be extra impressive. So I think doing exactly what a prior study has done is in most cases not enough to get something published in the kind of current dynamics of publishing. I'm not going to say whether or not that is right, but in my experience, that has been the take. If someone did exactly this before, why do we need to show it again? But there are ways that you can add value to a replication project that will make it, I think, easier to get that report published. So getting much larger samples, much larger data, that can be a real feather in your cap in trying to publish these things because you're adding a lot of verification information to what is already known. Collecting data in new places or lots of locations simultaneously kind of allows for a within study measure of generalizability or heterogeneity between places. That can be really useful for theory development and again can really add to our understanding of the robustness of results. And adding new questions onto replications can also be useful as well and can help satisfy some of the novelty concerns. So for instance, if you're examining moderators of a given phenomenon, especially if you're getting a bunch of data from a lot of places, that might really add to our theoretical understanding in a way we didn't have before. I think meta-science questions are a way that people navigate this as well, that it's I'm not only am I replicating this particular study, but I'm asking this question about how we do the science. That might be seen as a more novel contribution and might help get your paper into different journals. I think my strongest suggestion for this, and apologies for those that are working on trying to publish something that they've already collected, because I'm a few months too late, I guess, is do registered reports. Registered reports are a form of scientific publishing where you basically submit your plan for a study that you want to do and get peer review before you've actually done the study. I think this is great for a lot of reasons. It builds in things like pre-registration. It also lets that reviewer that was going to tell you later that you should have done something different in your study tell you before you do the study, which saves you a lot of time on the back end. And I think it in particular has a lot of benefits for replication work. So as I just mentioned, it front loads that peer review. It helps catch mistakes ahead of time, which can improve your study. It also helps with post hoc criticism. So say you do a replication study, you don't find what has been found before. That might invite extra scrutiny, which I think is reasonable given kind of our psychology. We pay more attention to things that don't make sense to us. And if people had to pass through your paper up front, maybe they find those errors in the beginning, but it also protects you a little bit from people coming back after the fact and saying, oh, well, this part of your study is clearly what caused the result to not replicate, because they didn't catch it before either. That helps with the review. It'll give you the chance to get what's referred to as an in-principle acceptance or an IPA. I love that acronym for that. Before doing the actual study. Before the results are known, you can know that regardless of what you find, this paper will have a home. That can be great for peace of mind, and again, can help protect against some of that post hoc critiquing. So I want to just quickly wrap up with some kind of general thoughts, tips, and tricks that I think are particularly useful when doing replication research. So the first is open science is your friend. I think generally it's good to be fairly transparent and open about your methods and what you've done in a study. I think it's particularly useful in replication work, given that it can be a potentially more contentious context for doing research. I think pre-registration is a good thing for research generally. I think it's a lot easier in a lot of replication studies. In particular, if you're trying to take the same study and do it again. You know the statistical model they applied, you know what outliers they corrected for, things like that. Since you have such a strong plan to base off of, it makes saying ahead of time what you're going to do with the data a lot easier. Open data can be really useful for streamlining reviews. Again, this I think can help generally, but particularly in replication projects. Reviewers might have questions about different model specifications, different ways to look at the data. No guarantees that they will do this, but I've had a number of people that if I share the data with the people reviewing, they will answer their own questions and report back to you, rather than say, hey, can you run, these 48 moderators and tell me what all the results were? They might look at them themselves. That is a bad example because the one time I have been asked to do that, the reviewer didn't do it for me, but there are a lot of other reviewers who are really nice and tested their own questions. And I think overall, just on a more philosophical level, the strongest evidence is that which withstands the strongest criticism. I think being open allows people to have kind of the fuel to critique what you've done. And I think that makes for a better and more meaningful impact. It can be tough interpersonally. It's a little bit more nerve-wracking if people can do a better job checking up on my work, but I think it helps the work stand up to scrutiny a bit more. In terms of mentality, I like to approach replication research with what I'm going to call curious humility, which is the idea that I might have some intuition about what I think will happen in a given study or when I try a given study again, but I very easily might be wrong. I'm wrong frequently, and I think guessing what's going to come out is another case of that. So I'm glad Joe isn't here to argue with me anymore. Intuitions are great, but go into it, I think, with an open mind. My personal preference, I tend to pick things that I think have a chance of replicating. I think there is a space for trying to validate stuff that you just think is absolutely wrong. But I guess for myself, I like having the possibility that things might turn out multiple ways. And again, if you're looking at moderators or of effects or meta-science questions, a bunch of nulls is really going to dampen your ability to test those questions. And also, I think as a general practice, it's good to assume good faith when working with people, especially original authors, until shown otherwise. So it takes a long time for them to get back to you, and they send you a really short response. They're probably busy. You ask for materials or data, and you get a letter from a lawyer back. That might be bad faith. So maybe assume it there, but that's incredibly rare. Most of the time, they're just busy. And finally, if you'll indulge my Friday Night Lights reference, I think this can all be summed up with the motto, clear eyes, full heart, can't lose. So understand that replications can be contentious on multiple levels. There are things extraneous to the science, but having to do with human interaction that complicates this process. That's a reality, and it's good to know that going in. But I think like all science, your best defense against that is to go into it with the right reasons and the right intentions. I think that guards you against a lot. So I'll throw this slide up there again, and happy to take any and all questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Very interesting. On the topic of contacting authors, have you guys have to dealt with or thought about how to bring along researchers either outside of the English-speaking world or whose first language is not English? Because in a field you can get along with like 1,000 words of English very well, but when it comes to dealing with sensitive words, it's very, very hard. And so I can see how that could be a big barrier.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have faced that or thought about that.
Yeah. So I've run into it less in the direction of interacting with original authors and more trying to take prior work and putting it in new contexts. So I think in psychology, the Psychological Science Accelerator, it's this big international lab group where we do big crowdsourced studies, a lot of them replications, is been a really interesting test case for that. And picking words for materials and manipulations that conceptually mean the same thing in a different language than they do in the original context is a big challenge. I think when it comes to interacting with original authors for trying to replicate findings, I think that's a current blind spot. I think we default too strongly to English-speaking researchers or at English-speaking institutions. And I think that's a real weakness of a lot of stuff that we've worked on. And I think it's an unfortunate byproduct of a lot of the folks that have been doing a lot of this work are from English-speaking countries, reading English-speaking papers, and that's their idea of where to go to. So definitely a challenge in the other direction. I think a difficulty and a weakness of where attention has been delivered in the direction you referenced.
Thanks very much for your talk. That was really interesting. I think on the same note, I guess I have sort of mixed feelings about the idea about contacting authors, because in one sense, I think in the ideal world, when I think about the first paper I read about replication, which was Gary King's paper, the whole idea is that the paper and the way it's published and the way it's written, everything that you need to reproduce it, maybe the materials even, you shouldn't need to contact the authors. And what you can reproduce or replicate without having contacted the authors, I think sometimes reflects the quality of reporting that doesn't. So by contacting the authors, it reinforces, I think, a bad norm, which is that, well, just contact us and we'll give you all the details and we'll do that. So I think that's one reason I think it might be useful to not contact the authors and to proceed and say, this is what we could generate and this is as close as we could get because these critical items were not reported anywhere. That's not necessarily the only way to do it. And I guess the other example I've seen was something that I think 3IE did when they did all these replications. Is they had a third party that was a go-between between the replicators and the original authors to try and maybe smooth out some of the tensions that can arise during these interactions. On what your thoughts might be about that.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second part. I think that is also a really great strength of the registered report publishing model. That in my experience, the editor kind of serves as that go-between in peer review as kind of the channel by which you have those conversations. So just another plug there because I think it can help. It's nice to have someone to kind of translate, and in particular in cases where you're trying to adjudicate what is a reasonable request or what is a reasonable deviation, having a third party helps with that. To your first point, I 100% agree with you. And I think it depends on what's the statement you want to make. So yes, it would be wonderful if all the materials were out there and you could reproduce the study exactly from the paper. In my experience, what tends to happen if you do base it off of the paper and say the results don't come out exactly right or exactly as they were before, you have the time where someone will comment and be like, oh, well, you have to do this little trick that's not in the method section to get the effect. And everyone who's in this field knows that, and that's why we get the effects and you didn't. I don't find that a convincing argument. Some people do. And I think it's, kind of where you want to be pragmatic versus idealistic. I tend to default to, I would rather avoid that comeback because I find it unsatisfying and then requiring a bunch more data to say something much more definitive about. So I'd rather dodge it up front. But I think there's a very principled reason to say, like, no, this was the report. We should be able to do it based on that. And if we can't, that says something about how it was reported. But it depends on what statement you want to be able to make.